welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the leftist Christian podcast that has some crazy, out-there beliefs, like being transphobic makes you a fucking arsehole regardless of whether a murdered trans person hears you or not. Crazy stuff. I'm Ben Molyneux-Headington, and I'm joined by Adam Spears and Jonny Bell. Jonny, how distant a relative of a murdered trans person is it okay to be transphobic in front of? Like a great aunt, a third cousin? What's the cut-off point?
I think even cousins,
Right, okay.
Trans people clearly aren't real, or, real people.
Yeah. Adam, are you happy with cousins is the answer?
I feel like I don't get a say in this. I feel like I don't want a say in this.
Yeah.
The only correct say in reality, of course, is Rishi Sunak's
Yeah. I mean, we could probably just release that as an episode most weeks, and that would be a fair, summation of how we're feeling. Possibly alternating Sunak and Starmer just for, a bit of variety.
Keep it fair.
For those missing the context of this, for those in blessed ignorance of what goes on in Parliament, Rishi Sunak, he made a transphobic comment trying to attack Keir Starmer, but the mother of Brianna Jai was in the audience, whatever the
gallery.
The gallery,
gallery.
sure. Yeah.
I can tell you watch Parliament all the time.
Yeah, I try and avoid it, but this really cut through. And basically, it was really controversial. And there was something really funny about people. Everyone knew that this was obviously a bad look. But basically, the implication, as I kind of alluded to in the intro, was that it's fine to be transphobic as long as you don't do it in front of people who might be affected by it. Because a lot of people who are basically on board with what Sunak was saying, well, this is too far, you shouldn't do it in front of... And then there was a pushback, and this really drove me mad, where some people were saying, actually, the mother hadn't arrived in the gallery till about 10 minutes after the comment was made, so it was totally fine to be horribly transphobic. And yeah, I think at that point I was just like, I am so done with all of this.
I think what was interesting was, so Keir Starmer obviously, on some level, did the right thing by calling him out straight away, saying, of all the days when Brianna Jai's mother is in the gallery. But, Keir Starmer doesn't have a great track record on this either, right?
No.
Which was actually kind of Rishi Sunak's horribly made point, is that this has all stemmed out of Keir Starmer doing yet another U-turn to the point where he now has none of his original policies left. It's one of those things where you're sort of caught between one form of arseholery and another form of arseholery.
Or British politics, as it's known.
Yeah, exactly. I want to be careful how I say this because obviously the Tories have sort of jumped on this, but it's very uncomfortable to kind of see Keir Starmer leading on this.
Well, it's crass political opportunism from Starmer, who has
exactly,
failed to do anything about the rampant transphobia within the Labour Party. He is not passionate about defending trans rights. He is passionate about taking an opportunity to make his opposition look bad. And the whole thing is just deeply cynical. And I think the whole thing is doubly cynical because I think fundamentally neither Starmer or Sunak probably really care. They're probably, like the majority of the British public, vaguely pro-trans rights without having much real thought about it. But they both are trying to win political capital through making trans people a political football, which is very bad and unpleasant.
Yeah.
Yes.
Quite happy to throw trans people under the bus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, Ben, did you just say crass rather than crass?
Possibly.
That's how we know that you are the posh one of the pod.
And not me.
That is not how we know that. There are so many ways that we know that.
That is an indicator of your poshness.
It is. I mean, you did come from the southeast in Bracknell.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, I come from a crap hole, but I come from a crap hole near where the Queen lives, or lived.
Exactly.
But now I live in Cambridge, so I'm scum of the earth again. It's a very, my class journey has been complicated.
I'm not sure that's how class works,
I'm pretty sure it is. It's about how I feel about the people around me. So, today, our main topic is still, as we have promised you, going to be focusing on everything that's going on in Palestine. We're going to talk through a document called Kairos Palestine, which is quite an old document now that was put together by a group of Christians in Palestine as a statement about the ongoing Israeli occupation. And it's a really powerful piece of theology. So we're going to kind of talk through it as our kind of main topic today. But before we get on to that, As always, we are going to start with what else is on my mind, Grapes.
What else is on my mind, Grapes?
Adam, I believe you have something on your mind, Grapes.
Yeah. So I went last week to the annual Church of England Estates Evangelism Task Group Conference.
Oh, that's a catchy title.
It is. Well, it's actually the Estates Evangelism Task Group and Partners Conference. And
Wow.
I went as part of my job.
Well, that's progressive, at least. It didn't just say spouses, it says partners, like this.
They even gave me a minute and a half to talk about my my work. So there we go.
Oh, that's good.
The thing is, when you're constrained to like a minute and a half, everything's rushing through your head. So you're like, and I'll do this, blah, 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 blah. And like, you can't stop long enough to like say it in a way that's going to cut through. So I think I probably, did just sound a bit like a chicken. But yeah, so I went to this conference and I kind of went into it skeptical. For those of you who don't know, the Estates Evangelism Task Group is like a group that's grown out of or is like associated with the National Estates Church Network. And basically this is a load of Church of England, mostly clergy, I think, though not entirely, who have a concern for things like poverty, the fact that the church is a very middle-class church and that working-class people generally aren't very interested in it. And the person who was heading that up for a long time was Philip North, who is the current Bishop of Blackburn, I want to say. Is that right? I think that's right. He was Bishop of Burnley and now he's Bishop of Blackburn, or
so.
The other way around. I can't remember. But anyway.
As everyone can tell from our accents, we don't really distinguish between Burnley and Blackburn.
Whoa, okay. I'm going to distance myself from those comments. But anyway, like, Philip North is not an uncontroversial character, as those in the Church of England will know.
That's a gentle way of putting it.
It is, yeah. But either way, he led on this for a while. Now it's led by a woman called Lynn Cullens, who is also a bishop, and who our blog has reposted before, so we have had something to do with her before. But I think what I was surprised about, right? So the keynote speech was given by another bishop called Rob Wickham. These people just love bishops, don't they? Goodness me. Hi folks, this is Adam in the editing booth, just jumping in to save you the next 20 painful seconds of me scrabbling around in the depths of my brain trying to remember what Rob Wickham's job title is. He is the CEO of Church Urban Fund, which is the charity set up in 1987 in the wake of the 1985 Faith in the City report. Prior to that, he was the Bishop of Edmonton and was acting Bishop of Portsmouth for a while, whilst they found a new bishop. And he is now an honorary assistant bishop at the same time. He gave the keynote speech. And at one point in it, I thought it was going to be a bit crap because he started talking about royalty, but then he actually was using it as a metaphor for calling out power, which I quite liked. And then at one point the next day in a panel Q&A session, bear in mind, this guy's a bishop in the Church of England. He basically said that the big problem that we're not talking about is capitalism. And I was like, yes! And I wanted to jump up and punch the air, you know.
But there is something about the way in which global economies operate, which mean that in this room, if we're serious about changing the nature of poverty, then the government and those sorts of focuses of our work aren't necessarily the only places to be focusing. Because most of our diocese, the Church of England and so on, colludes in all sorts of ways with the global banking industry. And that, for me, are the places where we need to be angry about, because the processes of economics, the process of capitalism, which all of us by our bank accounts and so on will be colluding with. I'm not decrying that kind of stuff. It's not a personal thing in terms of individuals and that sort of stuff. But there is a sort of sense for us to wake up and desperately see where the power dynamics actually do lie. And that is in the evils, which are in terms of global capitalism and the way capitalism operates.
I asked a question a bit later, and on the end of that question, just sort of thanked him. I said, thank you for talking about capitalism, because to me, it feels like the elephant in the room. We're talking about all this stuff, but the biggest problem in all of this is capitalism. And then shortly after that, a guy called Malcolm Brown stood up. Now, Malcolm Brown is a very influential figure in the Church of England who probably most people haven't heard of, but he's a vicar and an academic who specializes in Anglican social theology. So when I was still kidding myself that I was smart enough to do a PhD, I was doing it, at least in part, as a sort of critique of Anglican social theology. So I was reading a lot of Malcolm Brown. So I turned around. I didn't know he'd snuck in the room. I turned around and Malcolm Brown is going, I think we need to be careful about just throwing away capitalism when really it's neoliberal capitalism. And I'm like, and I really wanted to like jump up and go, no!
If we blanket condemn capitalism, it makes us terribly easy to dismiss as naive because we're not the opposite. We don't believe in totalitarian thinking. It's the particular phase of capitalism we're in that is the problem, not the fundamental approach of capitalism, I believe, which is, like so many things, the worst of all possible systems except all the others. But we are in a particularly dismal phase of capitalism where the sucking out of value from the majority to the minority has gone to the point where the majority are now turning to people like Trump in their distress. This is a really dangerous phase of capitalism, but it's not capital. If we just say we find capitalism a problem, we will be dismissed as naive and economically illiterate, because I don't think we believe in some of the alternatives to capitalism.
Yeah, obviously, for one thing, it's tricky. This guy is like, no doubt, this guy has far more learning than I do, but like, clearly there are some blind spots there. So I had a chat with him afterwards. Really nice guy. In my opinion, just wrong on this. So we sort of had a very brief discussion. Would have been better for it to be longer. But then Rob Wickham, the bishop who had originally said that capitalism is bad, came up and sort of joined the conversation. And I went off after a couple of minutes because I really needed a loo, I needed a drink, etc. It was a break before the next session. And I came back and they had taken their conversation outside and carried that conversation on all the way through. So it was a Eucharist. So they didn't even go to the Eucharist to have this conversation about capitalism and whether it's good or bad. And there's something positive about that for me. Yes, okay, these conversations should be conversations that we were having a long time ago, and maybe some people were, but clearly not enough. It was positive for me, though, that you have a bishop saying, look, capitalism is the real problem here. And having that long conversation with this theologian who's very influential, saying that, it's not capitalism per se. Obviously, we side with Rob Wickham on this. So, yeah, just in case anyone has been listening to our podcast and doesn't know what we think about capitalism.
Yeah, and I think there's probably something there about, even a institution like the Church of England that is fairly strongly part of the institutional structures that uphold both neoliberalism and capitalism.
Yep.
Things are getting to the point where even an institution like that, people are starting to see that it can't go on the way it is. That doesn't mean that things will, necessarily and unavoidably get better, but that the kind of plasters and hiding of the problems has been less and less effective.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there was a real kind of appreciation because there were a lot of interesting people who went to this conference, and I shared a taxi back to the train station with a couple of them, and one of them was the guy who's basically in charge of mission in the Church of England. And one of the points that he made, and it was a critical point, was that the Church of England isn't just one institution, right? Some of the complications around this stuff are that the Church of England is made up of many, many, many different institutions, all interwoven, and really, we need to think about that before we can even start to think about how the church deals with issues like capitalism.
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St George's College in Jerusalem, says, "I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK, and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering." To find details of local actions or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
Yeah, absolutely. The Church of England is this, web of many different institutions, all of which are awful in unique and special ways. So,
we could tell what you think of the C of E, don't we? So your wife is doing what?
Betraying my basic principles.
One of the things I've been trying to work out is why people are so resistant to naming it as capitalism. Because there's obviously that element of a kind of greater discourse, rhetoric, whatever you want to call it, of you shouldn't call it that, otherwise you're going to be a dirty communist or something.
Which, by the way, sorry to interject quickly, is exactly what Malcolm Brown said. His whole point was we shouldn't talk about it being capitalism in this way because it basically it makes us look silly, takes away from our seriousness. Which to me, I'm just like, I'm sorry, that's nonsense.
I wonder if there's also an element of self-preservation in this, of not just the silliness, or being perceived as not taking things seriously, not capable, not whatever the word is. But there's probably something about that fear of change, like a genuine, if this changes, is my life going to be harder? Am I going to be able to have my 4 coffees a day from Starbucks or wherever? Am I going to be able to travel as easily? Am I going to have as much money? Am I going to be able to afford heating as easily? Because in reality, I think a lot of people realise that our country exploits everyone else, pretty much, or, the West, in inverted commas. And if we were to change that, that would make our lives harder, but other people's lives easier.
I don't think people have gone that deep. Right? Okay. Even Malcolm Brown, because his whole thing was, we just need to change the model of capitalism, look at Finland. And I'm like, yeah, but Finland is still, has its issues, rising fascist movement in Finland as well. But its wealth is predicated on the extraction of resources from the global south. And I genuinely don't think that was particularly, I'm sure he's come across it before, but it wasn't featuring prominently in his thinking. Right. And I genuinely think that people don't really make that connection. They don't really think about that. I don't think they particularly think about how life would be different or maybe in some ways more difficult for them if we didn't live under capitalism. I just don't think people have gone that far. I think it's I think it's that kind of capitalist realism thing again, that idea that there's no alternative and it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
And I guess I've been giving people too much credit.
Yeah, to be honest, I just don't think they're thinking about it. Yeah,
a bit depressing.
Yeah, I think to be fair, people's psychology is complicated, and I think to boil it down to one thing, I actually think, to take a centrist position on it, I think there are certainly people to whom things are basically okay, and that major change, it's scary enough if you're not doing well, but if you're doing okay out of things, major change it's hard to see the appeal of. Yeah, I think there's a psychological complexity to people, and that we live in a system, a superstructure, if you will, that is constantly putting pressure on people to conform to capitalist ways of thinking and being, that makes it actually extremely hard to break out of that. And even those of us who are trying our best to do it, I'm sure we all find ourselves, thinking and being capitalists in unexpected ways, because that's just the air we breathe. What a depressing end to a segment. So our main topic for today is to talk through Kairos Palestine. Kairos Palestine is this fascinating theological document that was released in 2009, so a little while ago, but obviously a lot of what is there is still applicable, because although there's been the latest kind of push of post-October's attacks, the latest push of Israeli forces into Palestine, the occupation has been ongoing for a heck of a lot longer, and some of the ideas in it are still extremely relevant. Well, actually, all of the ideas in it are still extremely relevant. So we're just going to kind of talk through some of the things in it. I think it's got 10 sections off the top of my head, but it's this kind of introduction. They spell out the reality on the ground. Then they talk about faith, hope, and love in the response. And then there is kind of a section where they say, this is our message to different groups of people. So we're going to talk through some of what's in there. And I want to just start by reading a little bit of the introduction. So it says, we, a group of Christian Palestinians, after prayer, reflection, and an exchange of opinion, cry out from within the suffering in our country, under the Israeli occupation, with a cry of hope in the absence of all hope, a cry full of prayer and faith in a God ever vigilant, in God's divine providence for all the inhabitants of the land. Inspired by the mystery of God's love for all, the mystery of God's divine presence in the history of all peoples, and, in a particular way, in the history in our country, we proclaim our word based on our Christian faith and our sense of Palestinian belonging. A word of faith, hope, and love. And I think it's so important because it really sets out, and it goes through all the document, just how Christian a piece of writing this is, for a conflict that is obviously defined by many people in very religious terms. This document makes a really specific claim about the Christian nature of this response. The whole thing is dripping in Christian ideas, in scripture, in references to big Christian concepts. This is a really, really Christian response from the perspective of Palestinian Christians.
And one of the things that I sort of reflected on as I was reading it as well was kind of how traditionally Christian it sort of is as well. Not necessarily conservatively Christian, but like this is a thoroughly Christian document, and there's not a lot in it, because it's an ecumenical document. There's not a lot in it that any Christian can particularly take issue with.
It's a very orthodox document. And it's really interesting because it almost uses the language that would be accepted by most in order to make their point, because it means that people won't dismiss it as readily. Because if you can find issue with its theology, you can go, oh, well, its theological foundations are a bit blah, blah, blah. And so it kind of gives it a greater weight, not inherently, but a greater weight to other people. So it will hopefully be taken serious by more people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that really comes across in that section about the reality on the ground. And I think it's a really effective and clear summary of everything that is happening, or was happening at that point. Obviously, things have changed a bit since then, but most of what they say is still in place. But it does so in such a specifically Christian way. I mean, it starts with the quote from Jeremiah 6. They say, peace, peace, when there is no peace. And the language, it's not directly reflective of any particular creed or biblical language, but there's something so very Christian about the focus and the way the language is put. It is like they've translated the struggle of what it is like to be a Palestinian into a kind of Christian dialect almost, right? It feels so very Christian. And, they talk about religious liberty, but also, there's this line about prisoners. It just says, and the prisoners, the thousands of prisoners languishing in Israeli prisons are part of our reality. The Israelis move heaven and earth to gain the release of one prisoner. And those thousands of Palestinian prisoners, when will they have their freedom? And I don't think there's a specific thing they're referencing there, but that, those language of freedom for prisoners, the language of moving heaven and earth, all that stuff feels so powerfully Christian in a way that is, I think, really effective at, activating those kind of Christian instincts towards this issue.
I've been having, let's say, interactions with certain people recently who have this Zionist form of Christianity that isn't the kind of soft Zionism that you see from, the mainstream, but the very sort of strident, conservative, fundamentalist Zionism that's infected some of the thinking of some people close to me. And there's a part of me that would just love to sit down and read this document with them. Now, it's tricky because, trying to get those kinds of people in the room to take a document like this seriously is very hard. But it answers so many of those points. I mean, at one point, it makes a fairly sort of standard claim that Christians who think that the Bible is, at least in part, there to justify their suffering, obviously need to stop doing that, because that is not an authentic Christian message, because an authentic Christian message is grounded in liberation, is grounded in peace, is grounded in willing the good of the other. And that just so obviously isn't what these fundamentalist Christian Zionists are doing.
Yeah. So you've got this kind of first real section after the introduction where it talks about, the reality on the ground. And there's all sorts of stuff in there that I think we kind of talked about a little bit. The wall, military checkpoints, control of natural resources, lack of religious liberty. And it makes the point around the way that actually Arab clergy are not able to fulfill their roles because of the controls. Refugees, prisoners, the way that Jerusalem has been treated, the disregard of international law, the plight of Palestinians who actually live within Israel and the way they are treated, emigration. And it talks about Israel justifying itself as self-defense and recognizing that there is Palestinian resistance to this, but actually being really clear that the problem starts with Israeli aggression. If you listen to this podcast at all in the last few weeks, you've probably picked up these ideas, but it's really, really well set out and really clear. And then it kind of talks a little bit about the diversity of the Palestinian response and the difficulties of internal division. And then it says right at the end of this section, again, we repeat and proclaim that our Christian word in the midst of all this, in the midst of our catastrophe, is a word of faith, hope, and love. Which is obviously a biblical quotation. And then they use that to structure the next two sections around the word of faith, hope, and love. And again, that word of faith section is so powerfully orthodox. It literally starts with, we believe in one God, creator of the universe and of humanity. It's powerfully orthodox, but it sets out the grounding of the faith perspective on these issues.
With the faith part, I find how they talk about the land to be really interesting. And they talk about it in almost a way that Israel-Palestine is almost a nexus for all of the world, a sort of connecting part of the world where God can then work in and out of, a sort of back and forth way of working, which I thought was really, really interesting for me because I haven't thought about it very much. So to be kind of shown, land is really important, helps me to understand their perspective in a way that I wouldn't have necessarily contemplated.
And there's a universality to that concept of the land.
Yes.
And I think that is a really important counter to the Jewish people have a divine right to the land, and therefore the state of Israel is justified in all it does, which is a line that, to be honest, is taken a lot more by Christians than it is by Jewish people a lot of the time. But, actually to push back against that and say, yes, we recognize that this land has a unique role in the salvation history, in the story of Christianity, but that is a story that ends with universal salvation for all people, that ends with the expansion to the Gentiles of the promises of God. And so, actually, I think you're right, that land point is really fascinating, but it's really important that they respond to claims about the land with their own sense of what the land means, to say that yes, it is special and has an important place in the kind of story of Christianity, but also that is a universal land. There is a universal element to this rather than a exclusive element.
Yeah, and I like the way that in doing that as well, it fairly directly calls out certain theologians and theological ways of thinking. One bit that I find interesting is how it says that certain theologians in the West try to attach a biblical and theological legitimacy to the infringement of our rights. Thus, the promises, according to their interpretation, have become a menace to our very existence. The good news in the gospel itself has become a harbinger of death for us, which cuts really deep. The good news has become a harbinger of death. Your very faith, some of your co-religionists have turned that into something that brings you and your people death. And there's a pain in those words, a very, very tangible pain in those words that more people need to hear, I think.
And just after that point, there's also a line about using the Bible to support injustice. Strips the word of God of its holiness, its universality and truth. There's a reclamation happening there, right? And saying actually using the Bible in this way is not just, unpleasant for us, but is an injustice perpetuated against the Bible itself, against the holy book of our religion. You are, in some sense, attacking the word of God when you are using it to defend violence and oppression.
And they don't explicitly say this, but it isn't of God what's being done.
Yeah.
And I think, obviously, they can't say it necessarily explicitly, because otherwise it would really make them a target, in a sense. But to say, actually, God is love, what you're doing isn't loving, and actually is downright sinful. And some who believe in the devil, I don't believe in the devil, but some people who might believe in the devil might use that kind of rhetoric instead.
And I mean, you say they don't say it explicitly, but they come pretty damn close.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
The next bit after that.
Well, I was going to say, Adam, I think you should just read this whole bit in full, because I think it's so important that they close out the faith section with this
2.5.
Yeah, 2.5. I think it's so powerful and important. I think, yeah.
Okay, final section of 2.5. We also declare that the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land is a sin against God and humanity because it deprives the Palestinians of their basic human rights bestowed by God. It distorts the image of God in the Israeli, who has become an occupier, just as it distorts this image in the Palestinian living under occupation. We declare that any theology seemingly based on the Bible or on faith or on history that legitimizes the occupation is far from Christian teachings because it calls for violence and holy war in the name of God Almighty, subordinating God to temporary human interests and distorting the divine image in the human beings living under both political and theological injustice.
What a section. What a paragraph, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it uses again that kind of liberation theology kind of understanding of what happens when you have an occupier and an occupied, an oppressor and an oppressed, in that it distorts the humanity, it dehumanizes, distorts the image of God within humanity for both the oppressed and the oppressor. And I think that's a theme that liberation theology returns to time and again, and that I think we always need to return to time and again.
The next section is about hope, and I think I was really struck by the emphasis they put on it being a hope against all hopes. I think we've talked a little bit before about the kind of danger of hope, and that, hope becomes a salve for the real injustices.
I mean, that's the classic Marx line, isn't it? The one that everyone knows whenever you talk about Marx and religion, isn't it? That, it's an opium of the people, completely misunderstanding what he actually meant by that. And this is what he meant, at least in part.
And actually here, they are absolutely refusing to be an opiate for the people. Yeah. Because they are abundantly clear at the start of the hope section, there is no room for positive expectation. Despite this, our hope remains strong, but it is from God. And that, I think, is really so important, that what they're saying is there is no human reason to be having hope here. We are not assessing the situation and saying that it is hopeful, but we choose to be hopeful based on our Christian faith. And I found that really important. As we talked about before, hope can be really unhelpful, but actually a hope that says we hope not because of, but despite of our understanding of what's going on is, I think, a really useful way of thinking about hope.
And it's really remarkable, Like, if I were in their situation, I don't think I could do that, despite being someone who you would presume is quite faithful. And yeah, to be in such a desperate situation and still hold on to that, the strength of those people is, I'm finding it difficult to find the words to describe it, but it is remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. And all the more remarkable for the length of time it's had to be remarkable for.
Indeed.
This is written a fair while ago, but they've had to be remarkable for a very long time before that as well.
Yeah.
You're right, it is remarkable. But there's a part of me that kind of, and I'm not sure I can find the right words to describe this, because I'm not disagreeing with you inherently, but there's something else going on there as well, I think, in that it's remarkable, but it's remarkable because that's within our human nature as well. We often hear about human nature being, people all the time when I talk to them about communism, anarchism, socialism, anything like this. Oh, well, you just haven't thought about human nature. And I'm like, no, oh, stupid me. How could I not think about
Damn it, I knew there was something I was missing.
Do you know what? Marx, when he wrote Capital, he didn't take human nature into account at all, did he? There. Just, good Lord. But no, I mean, there's something there about, and I don't want to sound harsh here, but overemphasizing how incredible it is that they deal with it in this way, that to me almost runs the danger of like the noble savage myth, because that humanity is in all of us and the inhumanity is in all of us as well. And I don't want to take away from how incredible it is that they respond in that way, but I also don't want to turn desperate people into my inspiration porn. I don't know. Does any of that make sense?
Yeah, it does, I guess. And it also avoids that risk, as you're saying, of patronizing or condescending or pitying, actually.
And avoiding that danger as well, I think, of, by saying how remarkable they are, it almost becomes, well, really, by being in this situation, they've had the opportunity to develop such important skill, actually.
Which means that we do sod all about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really effective way of expressing sympathy without actually doing anything about it.
Yes.
I tell you the vibes it gives me when we do that too much. It gives me the vibes of people who go on mission trips to various African countries and say, oh, they're just so faithful in spite of everything, in spite of having so little. It's amazing how poverty just, it strengthens your relationship with God. And I'm there like, do you realize what you're saying?
Yeah. And I think it's, for me personally, the reason why I find it remarkable, and I'm not, when I've been in hard times, and I have been in really hard times in my life, not comparable to this. I don't want to go to any comparison, but I haven't been able to hold on to hope. So I find it remarkable when people in awful situations are still able to hold on to hope. I guess it's an analogous way of seeing it, by analogy to myself, putting myself, or trying to put myself in their situation.
Always bringing it back to you, Johnny.
Absolutely.
Me.
And that's why I'm a leader of the church.
So there's a section as well about signs of hope. And there's a few bits about, which I think are important, about ecumenicism and interreligious dialogue and how they see the signs of hope. That these are long processes, but they are starting to kind of come together. It's really important. But I was really struck by the emphasis on the hope they see in the memory. That the Nakba is 1948. This is a long old time ago.
Well, and ongoing.
Yeah. But it's over 60 years since the start of it. And actually, they really emphasise what hope there is in the fact that the people of Palestine retain a memory of what things could have been like and what has been done. And I find that, finding hope in the memory, a really fascinating concept.
It shows you how hope can be a revolutionary force as well, right? Because sometimes, you'll hear people on the left talk about hope kind of being a counter-revolutionary force in some respects, and I get that as an argument. But I see people in Palestine walking around with the keys to their houses worn as necklaces to remind them and those around them of what happened to them in and after 1948, that they had their houses, their land, their homes, their homeland stolen from them, and their houses destroyed and then built on, and had forests planted over them and that kind of thing, as if, to try and make out that this never happened, right? And I see these people, in this case, walking around with the keys to their homes that they have been displaced from as a sign of hope. And I also see the Israeli response to that, because they target people who have keys around their neck, because that's a symbol of hope, and it's a symbol of what happened, and it's a tangible, real symbol, a symbol in the original sense of the word, that it's a real, actual thing that points to a lived reality. And no wonder Israel wants to crush that, because it wants to crush hope, just as it wants to crush hope of the right of return for the Palestinian people. And it wants to displace those people further to take up this whole idea of the greater Israel. And the most important way for them to fulfill that is to crush the hope that the people still hold for their right to return.
And the keys thing reminds me of when we had that episode about speaking truth to power, and what Diogenes did of when he got beaten up by someone, would write their name on him and walk around shaming them.
This section kind of ends with a bit about the mission of the church, and a lot of it is, very strongly that liberation theology tradition, the prophetic witness of the church, and that's really great stuff. And there's a section which I think is really fascinating, because it doesn't do this explicitly, but it kind of implies that actually the world church needs to learn from the Palestinian church what it means to be the church. It's not quite as explicit about that, but it kind of says we've been in a situation that really forced us to understand properly what it means to be the church. They have, in fear and trembling, have worked out what it means to be Christian, what it means to be the church, and they might, kind of imply it, or it's there as an idea. And I think, I'd happily say that outright, that we can learn a lot about what it means to live out a Christian faith, what it means to be the church, from Palestinian Christians and the Palestinian church, because they have actually had to find out at the sharp end what that looks like.
And there's that liberation flavour of, it talks briefly about resurrection at the end, but that flavour of life to the full on this side of life, not just in the life to come. Like, it's a here and now, it can be better, and we can achieve these things, as well as not just a focus on life after death, as it were.
The final of these kind of three sections is the one on love. And I found this really, really fascinating, because it really does a really good job of talking about love in ways that aren't quite flimsy, I guess. That it's love with a bit of strength to it. And, talking about how the call is a call of love, but that love doesn't mean ignoring evil, but loving someone means challenging when they do evil. And there's something almost evangelical, right, about, it doesn't say love the sinner, hate the sin, but and that's not at all what it's saying. But there's something almost there that they've kind of taken in an interesting direction to say. And again, this is quite liberation theology as well. But loving someone means challenging them. It means not letting them be evil. It means pushing back. And I was fascinated by the first kind of subsection of love is resistance. And that's not a kind of, well, now we've talked about love, let's talk about resistance. It frames resistance explicitly as an act of love, and love as the measure by which the efficacy of resistance is measured.
Yeah, and I think I really struggle with this section as someone who thinks about violence. It sounds crazy to say this, but I find violence a very interesting, a very fascinating topic. And think about what violence means and what forms of violence there are and resistance to violence and so on, an awful lot. I struggle with this section, not because I think it's bad, because I think it's not, but because I think, we've spoken on this podcast many times at this point about violence and responses to violence, and how non-violence can be a very effective tactic, but that it's not the be-all and end-all. Here, it is saying, 4.2, resistance. The word is clear. Love is the commandment of Christ our Lord to us, and it includes both friends and enemies. And they start by quoting Paul about not repaying evil for evil, abuse for abuse, and so on. They're making quite a clear and robust argument about violence here. And I think their reasoning from a Christian standpoint, I can't fault it. But from a practical standpoint, it's that classic thing of, okay, perhaps not in this situation, but there have been plenty of examples throughout history of when, non-violence didn't do the job and violence met violence, and that was what stopped the violence. And I struggle with that,
See, I think it's interesting because what I would say is what I was struck by is that, yes, the movement is towards non-violence within it. The kind of implication is there. But it really carefully, and I don't know if this is, the nature of it being an ecumenical document produced, in collaboration, there was no condemnation of Palestinian self-defense or even Palestinian violence within there. And as someone who, in kind of as you put it, Adam, I'm not a pacifist. I do think there is, violence is complicated and something needs to be very careful around. But I do think there are times where the use of force is appropriate. But there's often within the Christian movement around this sort of thing, there is often a tendency towards pacifism. And this is kind of present in this. But I do think there's something really interesting about, to me, this statement does not preclude the possibility of some level of necessary self-defense violence. It might not be happy about that, but it certainly doesn't preclude it as a possibility, and it avoids really stringently condemning violence. As we talked about in the earlier section of it, it places all the blame for the violence on the occupation and what Israel has been doing in Palestine. And you kind of see that reflected in that, they do not pass the "do you condemn Hamas" test, partially because, they don't really talk about Hamas and all the rest of it. But I was struck by the way it didn't condemn anyone choosing to defend themselves with force.
I mean, it doesn't condemn anyone doing that. I think you're right. But it sort of doesn't, well, A, it doesn't need to, and B, I think it is quite deliberately avoiding doing that because it recognises the complications of that. But it does rather heavily imply that kind of violent resistance is not what they're going for. It says that resistance is important, it's a duty.
And it even says, we affirm that every citizen must be ready to defend his or her life, freedom and land. We respect and have a high esteem for all those who have given their life for our nation. And you're right, that's not saying, this is a good thing, but I guess what I'm saying is that my expectations was that it would be full violence as well in all its forms, and it's maybe not. I think you and I, Adam, probably said a similar thing in terms of we would be slightly more towards there is a level of acceptable violence place, but it's closer to our position than I expected it to be going in, perhaps.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I think for me, what it does well is it talks, it uses, I quite like the theology of the Imago Dei, the sort of image of God and the other. And what they are doing in this is stopping that othering of the perpetrator just being a perpetrator, but instead almost what they were saying about the land being a source of universal salvation. It's like, actually, no, we are all included in this, and we are all images of bearers of God's image. And then within that, what we're talking about of defending and resisting evil is actually, there's something quite positive in that. But I wonder if the hesitation in it to talk about violence being a necessity at times is, again, what we spoke about in terms of that orthodox theology of trying to make it so it's taken more seriously. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in there. I mean, I still think it errs a lot more on the side of shouldn't be killing. I mean, it says it is not permitted to hate, neither is it permitted to kill or to be killed, right? So it does say, and, when we're talking about violence here, right, we're talking about lethal violence, right? We're not talking about necessarily other forms of violence. We're talking about lethal violence here. So that theme is fairly directly stated there, but it's also stated in the context of people resisting their oppression, which is why it has to tread very carefully, and perhaps why it's appealing to that kind of orthodox sensibility.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated thing, and I certainly think, it's important to reflect on the ways we agree and the ways we disagree with this. It's a remarkably powerful and remarkably direct document, but it is never going to be as direct as we would be in a statement that the three of us put out.
Well, honestly, I don't know where I am on the question of violence, because I agree with this document. I agree that that's what the Bible says, and that's what the core of our faith is. I'm just saying that there's a massive impracticality at the heart of that.
I guess it's acknowledging that any ethics that you have on violence, there's an element that it needs to be contextual.
I'm always struck by it, and I don't know if I fully agree with it, but the whole Bonhoeffer thing about trying to kill Hitler, even though I know doing it is wrong, it's more wrong to not do it, right?
Yeah. And there needs to be acknowledgement that as human beings, we are innately violent, because in order to live, we're heterotrophs. We have to eat other living organisms in order to survive.
Well, we don't have to.
Well, even if they're plants, they're still living organisms.
Yeah. Adam only eats plastic. Sorry.
I'm a fruitarian. I only eat something that's fallen from the tree.
But even those things that have fallen from the tree are still alive. And that's the really interesting thing about it. And like with plants, for example, there are ideas that they're colonies of living organisms rather than a single living organism. So, eat one animal, as it were. Or,
animals as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's something about our very living that is inherently violent that is really difficult to contend with. I haven't come up with any resolution on this or anything. It's just something that's kind of there in my mind.
I mean, one of the fundamental concepts within veganism is not that you're not going to be harming in any way. It's that you should be taking every step to reduce to the minimum the harm that you do. Yeah. And obviously, like Jainism has a very similar thing. They won't go outside if it rains because that brings up more kind of organisms on the ground that if you stand on them, you might kill them. And they don't wear, there's like the order of Jain monks that don't wear clothes because it will harm the creatures on their skin, And this is pre-scientific thinking, but actually a lot of it is, regardless of what you make of the moral element of that, there's a scientific truth, if you like, a pre-scientific truth within that. So
to round us out, the kind of final sections of it are kind of direct messages to various groups of people. It is worth reading in full. There's really fascinating stuff, but I just wanted to finish this off by picking out the section of the message to the church in the world. It starts with a little bit of thank you for what you've been doing, and then really quickly it's like, and it explicitly says this is a call to repentance because you have supported unjust things. And again, it's this really theological segment, and it's directly saying to the churches, you need to support us. Stop doing what you're doing and either directly or indirectly supporting Israel and actually support us. And, like we're talking about with the whole loving thing, it kind of finishes by saying, are you able to help us? And explicitly says us being the people in Palestine and the people in Israel live together in peace. But it's a really, a direct call of the church has done wrong and it needs to do better. And it does actually call for, it doesn't explicitly say BDS, because I think this might predate BDS or was around the same time, but it kind of talks about divestment and boycotting. So, it's a really explicit call and even suggests that churches could come and visit to see what things are like. Again, going back to the whole learning thing. And I think, if you can take one thing from it as a church, it would be that call to repentance that they are very explicitly putting out.
And in some ways, this is where they kind of start to diverge in some ways quite subtly from potentially from sort of Orthodox theology, because a lot of Orthodox theology sees sin and holiness as a really individualistic thing, which is why in the past sort of 50, 70 years, people with their more intersectional analysis of things are saying, no, it's more systemic stuff. And this is where it kind of goes, no, you are complicit in this, whether you're, regardless of whether you're individually doing things or not, you are still complicit as a church. And therefore, you do need to repent. You need to turn back to God and help us and understand us and our situation.
I think that will nicely draw us to a close. It's a really fascinating document. We'll link to it in the show notes. So if you do want to go and read it, please do. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Jonny and Adam, for joining us. Jonny, where in the world can people find you?
I've got an email address, phone number.
Yeah, so we'll put Jonny's phone number out and we'll put a guide to kind of how you can disguise your phone number so that you can just prank call him day and night.
It's the landline that sits in my office. I don't think he'll bother me when I'm sleeping.
Adam, where in the world can people find you?
You can find me on TikTok, on the website formerly known as Twitter, at CommieXIAN. The other thing is that we are currently collecting MPs' responses to constituents' letters and emails on Israel and Palestine to put in a single place on our website. So if you have any MPs' responses that you'd like to share, and your details will be anonymized, by the way, if you want to send them to breadandrosaries@gmail.com, and then I will include them in that. That would be great. And please do ask your friends and family members to do the same. The more we have, the better, just to try and hold some of these bastards to account just a little bit.
All the contact details for the podcast are in the description. They're also on our website, breadandrosaries.com. Please do get in touch with us. We do love to hear from people. Feedback, thoughts, opinions, telling us we're wrong about everything. All of that is very welcome. Please do get in touch. Review us. We've got a Patreon. We've got all that good stuff. Recommend us to your friends, but not the friends that are going to get really angry about it. And thank you very much for listening.